Hey y'all, Austin Kleon here. I'm in my studio in Austin, Texas, and I could not be more delighted to be talking to Tim Kreider, one of my favorite writers, one of the best writers I think working right now. Hi, Tim.
Hello. I
Where
also
are
at my piano for the record.
we are both sitting at our piano, so if things go downhill, we might just
Just
duel
piano duel.
and sign off. Um, if y'all, I want to do a really brief introduction to Tim because I I want to get in. I want to start talking immediately because I have so much to ask you. The Literati book club that we are that this event is ostensibly under. We are reading We Learn Nothing. Tim, I want you to know that people love this book. I mean, I think you know that already, but
That's
I was a
weird.
little I didn't know. You never know with any book that you put in front of people, and people have been overwhelmingly positive about it, and they
I'd love
love it.
to do that.
So I know that everyone, So Tim, in a former life, for those of you who don't know, Tim was a political cartoonist for years. That now he is an essay writer. I don't need to qualify it that way. He is a writer now primarily, and he has done two fantastic books of essays. In addition to his other books, which were books of cartoons, We Learn Nothing, and this came out in 2018. Tim, I think.
The years have gotten a little blurry these last few. Yeah, that sounds right.
So the second collection is I Wrote This Book Because I Love You. And this is a book about Tim's relationships with women. And it was kind of came out at a weird time. And I think it didn't get the attention that I think it would have if it were not for the timing. Do you feel like that's fair, Tim? I don't
That
know.
hadn't really occurred to me. I'm used to not getting attention, so I didn't think there were any special circumstances attendant upon it. Yeah, as you said, I used to be a cartoonist, so
Right.
not
So
getting
you
attention is the default.
My my favorite cartoon of all time is that Clyban quote where there's the guy with the girls on his arm and there's a police officer beating someone. And it says, "Out of the way, you swine! A cartoonist is coming
Yeah,
through." Probably one of my favorite cartoons.
I think
I
it often.
I used to have a tag on my blog that was called "Pity the Poor Cartoonist," and it
Hmm.
was all cartoonists complaining. Um, I think Adrian Tamim put out that book, "The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist."
I'm friendly with the Pulitzer-winning novelist Charles Johnson, but I discovered him because he used to be a cartoonist back in the
Oh wow.
60s and 70s, and he did hilarious single-panel Clive-esque cartoons about race. And
Okay.
I'm really gratified to discover that he, like every other living cartoonist, is bitter and surly that he was not more appreciated as a cartoonist and is merely famous as a writer.
So this is a great thing. So I think that people fundamentally misunderstand cartoonists and they misunderstand comedians. Could you talk a little bit about where you think humor comes from? Is that too
Uh,
broad of a question to start with? But I feel like people really misunderstand. It's like the old story about the famous clown.
oh
It's
yeah.
it's like so much of humor and comedy comes out of deep pain and sadness.
Well, let me sidle my way up to answering that by saying that, yeah, I think it's sort of a truism among people who are funny professionally that, I mean, maybe it sounds like a tautology to say it, but they don't get taken seriously.
Right.
Yeah, and I know some great comic writers like Richard Russo. Now he also won a Pulitzer, but he says it's not easy for a comic novelist to get taken seriously. And I think that most people who work in humor find that to be true. I mean, a select few get lavishly rewarded, become stars, but still, they pretty much have to die before anyone thinks of them as making serious contributions to the culture. Like, I don't know, George Carlin or Mark Twain. Um, but you know, the only people who are saying anything remotely true anymore are all humorists. I
All
mean,
comedians,
the
yeah, and
the
humorists.
the nightly comedy shows are the only place anybody says anything that's not officially sanctioned, you know, propaganda or, you know.
Right. I feel like I read this really esoteric. I don't think it's in print, but it was a book by this guy named Joseph Meeker, and it's called The Comedy of Survival. And Meeker was a literature professor, I think, and an ecologist. So he was using comedy to unite his ideas about ecology and literature. And his feeling was that every Western civilization has sort of built itself on the tragic model of the,
Mm.
you know, the heroic individual who strives and fights and whatever. And his point was that, you know, in order for us to survive, we need to think more like we're in a comedy. That we
Mm.
need to think more of being people who adapt and build alliances and kind of muddle through and are improvisational. I don't know if
Yeah.
that rings true with you at
And,
all.
you know, the hero in a comedy is usually pathetic or
Is a
sluggish
low,
or
yeah,
failure. And that's just, I mean, I think there's a strain of Japanese culture that regards failure as heroic, where the happy ending is that the guy's cause is utterly obliterated and he commits suicide. But mostly in the West, that's not uh, an honorable or happy thing. It's, you know, it's only in comedies where the person we're rooting for is almost sure not to get the girl, you know, not to come out on top, like Buster Keaton or, you know, whoever. Like it's understood that that's the screw up, the loser. And you know, Americans don't generally celebrate losing.
I think that's the thing, and they also can't really take. Most people aren't very good with like nuance or any kind of, you know, they don't like. I'm obsessed with Heraclitus's idea of the harmony of opposites. You know, that you, so that there are opposite tensions in the world, and or there's opposites in the world, and it's really the tension between them, just like a piano string. It has to be the right tension. If it's
Hmm.
too tight, it snaps. If it's too loose, it doesn't make any music. So it's kind of like, I just feel like, you know, this idea that humor could come out of pain and sadness, it's very hard for some, particularly I think American people, to
Of course, it's the
process.
only thing it ever comes out of.
Right.
I
And
mean, you know, any comedy that's worth calling that, you know, anything above the level of puns, maybe. Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess it's hard for me to think about this because I internalized that understanding so long ago that you know, funny people are generally unhappier even than everybody else.
so that's a really good point, because I know
You
you're a
learn to
teacher.
metabolize it
Yeah.
into
But
humor.
but what you just said, I've internalized this so long ago that I it doesn't even come to mind. Do you find that really difficult as a teacher? Because for me, when I'm writing and when I'm talking to people about different, you know, whether it's I'm talking to them about how I think creativity works, or whatever it is, you know, especially when I'm talking to younger people or beginners, I forget. You know, there's a great C.S. Lewis story where he says, you know, schoolboys can teach other schoolboys better than the teacher can, because the schoolboy has just figured it out and he can speak the
Yeah.
language of the other schoolboy. Do you find that hard in teaching to sort of back up and remember where your students are coming from, or do they make you do that?
Yeah, well, Steven Pinker calls that the curse of knowledge. You know, it's very difficult to remember or imagine not knowing what you now know. So it's very
Right.
difficult to reverse engineer how to explain what you know to somebody who doesn't. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the challenge of teaching. I mean, you have to kind of articulate explicitly to yourself things that you've learned through a kind of muscle memory,
Yeah.
or just through embarrassing trial and error. But also, your students force you to by, you know, well, usually by being bad at things, and you have to figure out what do they not know that they're doing this. So sometimes you have to back up far enough to say things like, I'm sorry, maybe I forgot to mention in essays, it's okay to come out and say what you mean.
Right.
Actually, people coming from other disciplines like fiction or poetry, that's kind of a no-no. That
Right.
means that you screwed up or did your job incompetently.
Show, don't tell.
And I
You know.
remember having to learn that when I wrote my first critical essays, like, you actually have to come out and say what you're talking about here. You have to like draw the connections and state your conclusion for people. And I worried
Explicitly.
about, because I was taught, like everybody else who went to like writing programs around the time I did, to write fiction, which I
Right.
was never any good at. But you know, in that field, you don't come out and tell people what you're saying. You know, you illustrate it.
So I want to take that up and ask you about your education, because I'm really interested. Did you study writing in school?
Yeah, I
So,
was in the what was called the writing seminars program at Johns Hopkins.
oh, okay.
So I studied, well, it would not be quite honest to say I studied under people like John Barth and Edward Albee. I was in classes taught by those people, but
Right.
uh, you know, they wouldn't remember me. I learned, yeah, I went to a writing program in the 80s, and back then there wasn't really a market for what I now do. And so no one was bothering to teach you how to write essays or creative nonfiction, as they call it. You know, you were supposed to write short stories, and I never had any idea, nor do I to this day, how to write fiction. I did
Me
not know
neither.
how you make things up that still sounded real.
No, the only person who made it remotely approachable, and I don't know if you know her. Her name is on the back of one of your books. Is Lauren Groff. Um,
Who made what look approachable? Writing fiction?
yes, because I mean, to give me a thought of how it could how I could possibly do it, because her last book, Matrix, which I don't know if you've read that,
No, I
it's
haven't yet.
incredible. But she gave this talk at Notre Dame, and she was like, "Look, here's everything I was doing that led to this book, because it's a historical fiction." And
Hmm.
so she was using actual people in history to base the characters off of. There's still it's not like she just is, but that's where the inspiration came from. And she was able to sort of, this is online, so I'll send it to you later, but she was sort of able to take people through that process in a way that I was like, "Oh, I get this." It didn't detract from anything. It wasn't like it's still a mysterious and beautiful and wonderful book, but she did explain it in a way I was like, "Oh, okay. This I could actually see attempting, not being good at." You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Because she was
Yeah,
so good at taking you through that.
I guess
But I
what I could never, sorry,
no, no, please.
what I could never figure out was how to make up a plot that satisfied the, you know, demands of Aristotelian dramaturgy, that ramp, and and yet also resembled real life, which does not have any plot and in which there's no sense or justice at all. Like, I guess I've taken to saying that I don't understand life well enough to make things up. Like, all I can do is say what happened, and here's what I think about that. That's the best
Or
I can do for you.
can you, yeah, I think of you as someone who is investigating so much that you might not feel comfortable with going with the kind of plot mechanics that, a lot of fiction runs on. I mean, I could see that being a problem too. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I was thinking about, I'm sure you're someone who it's like, well, you used to be a cartoonist and now you do these essays. What about graphic novels?
Mhm.
And I think I remember reading you saying, yeah, but I was a single panel cartoonist.
Yeah, you'd
Yeah.
think that a graphic novel would be the thing I would do, but I just feel like those two things are produced by completely different parts of my brain. Like when I was a cartoonist, I did not get essay ideas. Now that I'm an essayist, I do not get. I once in a while get a cartoon idea and say, "Oh, if I was a cartoonist, I would do that." But it doesn't translate into. I couldn't write an essay about it. And I think cartooning is the superior art form, and I think I was a better cartoonist than essayist. And like Charles Johnson, I am surly about the fact that I was never really paid any attention to at all. I think it's a more elegant art form because you can
Yeah,
say a whole nonfiction book's worth in one panel.
in one panel.
If it's
Yeah.
an elegant, brilliant one panel like B. Cliven or Charles Johnson or someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the fridge test for me. Like, there are cartoons that people could keep on their fridges for 50 years.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I read peanut. So I have two kids. I mean, this is a big way that our lives split. Is that I have two boys, and I've been married for 15 years. So when
Well,
Dana
you have a
here,
cat for 19 years, Austin.
well,
I'm
so
not a completely
you,
irresponsible
you
individual.
know what it's like then to have wild beasts in your house. I'm sure your cat was more dignified and well behaved than my children.
Cats have a lot of dignity. That's
They
true.
do.
But you were
I, I
saying, right.
I didn't know that the neighbors got some cats, and they decided that they lived in our backyard for a while. And I was never a cat person, and I
Hmm.
had these cats show up in my backyard, and I loved them. And then they moved to Elgin, so now I'm bitter.
Yeah,
Um,
well, that's what happens. It just
yeah,
shows up and says, "I'm your cat now."
that okay. I'm fascinated by this. That cats just say you.
Yeah,
They
they do.
pick you.
It's a great honor. But I didn't want a cat. I was not responsible enough to come home once every 24 hours in those days. I was like, "No, you don't understand. I don't want a cat." And she was like, "I am your cat now." I was like, "I think I'm going to put up some, cat found posters and maybe, take you to the local shelter." She was like, "I am your cat."
I just have so much. I just have so much to. The thing I was going to tell you is that
Yeah, I was,
we have one of those page a day count. I buy my kids a page a day. They have Peanuts collections. They have all sorts of cartoon books around. What they really love is those page a day calendars that they put out because they like to sit at the table during dinner and like flip through them. And there's still Peanuts comics that they just still pass the fridge test. Like you
yeah,
could put them on the fridge. I guess that's a good. I would love to ask you. We have met in person before. I don't know if you remember this,
where was
but um, I saw you give a lecture at the Dallas Museum of Art
Oh,
in two
wow.
in 2012.
Yeah, I remember that occasion very clearly, but I didn't know you.
Yes,
Did we talk?
we talked briefly, but it was a signing line
Yeah, right.
situation, and you gave this wonderful lecture about George Grosz.
Right.
And I
And the
wanted to
work you did
ask
in the art.
you, it was wonderful. I mean, I don't to the people listening, George Grosz was a cartoonist. I mean, it's weird to even call him a cartoonist. I mean, it's so
He was. It's
he
it's somewhere in that
was.
no man's
Um,
land between cartoons and fine art.
yeah, but he's doing this. It's like Weimar Germany. And maybe you can explain Gross a little bit better, Tim, than I can. I don't know. The interesting Texas connection with George Gross is he actually came to Dallas at one point and did these watercolors
I think he
of
was
like,
commissioned.
yeah,
Yeah, well, and the work he did in America, nobody knows.
yeah, like
The work he did in Weimar Germany was so grotesque and so cruel that it's unforgettable. But then he moved to the U.S. I mean, he fled here like many other
yeah.
artists and people of all persuasions. And the work he did here is not what made him famous. It's not that memorable because he wasn't bitter and furious and miserable here.
Uh,
And that reminds me, not sure this is relevant to your point, but I only learned
doesn't matter.
a month ago that De Chirico was not killed in the First World War, which I always assumed he was, because you never see a De Chirico painting done after like 1920. But he
So what
lived
happened?
until the 70s. He just became a reactionary. He decided
Oh,
no, classical artistic training is what's needed, and he did work that's not uninteresting and it's not bad, but it utterly lacks the quality that made his work great in the teens and 20s. He just stopped doing what he was doing that people liked. And artists get to do whatever they want, and it's kind of an accident when it intersects with popular taste or whatever's artistically in fashion.
well, I'm just really I love hearing personally. I love hearing you say that you're a little bitter that your cartoons didn't get the acclaim and like your essays have taken off or more because I feel like we're all that way. We all feel like, well, my really good stuff is
Hmm.
stuff that no one looks at. I
Sure,
think
but
we
As in the case of DeChirico and Grosz, I don't know that artists are the best judges of what their best work is.
I don't think they are. I had a conversation yesterday with an editor, and I said, "Can't you just go through this stuff and tell me what's good?" Like, I don't know. It's just all this stuff.
Yeah. Well,
So,
and sometimes artists become insanely popular and they're not sure why, but they just then keep doing that thing that people seem to want. And we call these people sellouts. And usually their work is not that highly regarded after a while. I mean, I got to respect people like DeChirico who do work that nobody likes anymore, but he believes that's what he wants to do.
sellouts to me are just anyone more successful than me. So, that's the
Basically,
definition of.
everyone.
Where are you, Tim?
Where geographically?
Yeah.
I am, well, speaking of people more successful than us, I am sort of a squatter in a much more successful writer's apartment. She's an old friend of mine, and she teaches on New York's Upper West Side and has a very swank faculty apartment here, which is where I camped out for the entire pandemic while she fled back to her actual home.
I was going to ask you because I'm interested in Baltimore, and I'm interested in what Baltimore means to you and to your work. It's just I haven't spent that much time there, but I have friends who live there, and it seems like this really unique place.
Well, I would like to be thought of as a Baltimore artist. I mean, I haven't lived there in 20 years, but that's my hometown, and I feel like that's the place that really shaped me. I'm currently rewatching The Wire with my girlfriend. She's watching it for the first time. And there are scenes of like cops vomiting outside bars at 2 a.m. that make me so nostalgic for that place. Yeah, I can't tell you. Just hearing the accent, which is unlike the accents anywhere else on the Eastern Seaboard. Like that's how everybody at my church talked when I was a kid. Yeah, I'm very fond of the place. And I feel like, that John Waters quote, New York is full of normal people who think they're crazy. Baltimore is the other way around.
Right.
And I feel like I'm a Baltimorean and just something about the aesthetic and the ethos of that place is in my blood, in my bloodstream as an artist.
I love that. I mean, I'm from the sticks in Ohio, and I don't feel that connection. I'm one of those typical American rural kids that just couldn't wait to get out.
Sure.
And later, of course, they'll realize how fundamental and shaping it really was.
I wrote an essay about Baltimore a few years ago, comparing it, I thought, favorably to New York, where I now live. And it, of course, insulted and infuriated everyone in both Baltimore and New York.
Both places. You ended up pissing off both groups.
Yeah. Baltimoreans were like, how could you say that about Baltimore? I was like, that's what I like about Baltimore. I thought it was a complimentary essay. It was an homage to my beloved hometown.
You mentioned that you've been in New York for this whole plague. Your essays, to me, so many of them seem rooted in friendships, and you're staying in a friend's house. How have you been able to maintain your friendships during this time?
Well, there's probably some of them that I've neglected. I'm still not great at getting back to people. I mean, I got pretty desocialized in quarantine, but I've got a group of friends who used to get together for happy hour every Wednesday night here in the city. And we've been doing that through Zoom for 2 years now, going on 2 years. And I've got a friend who lives just a few blocks away, and he gave me a VR headset at the beginning of the pandemic. And we play miniature golf in VR in all kinds of exotic locales like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and Shangri-La. And this is much superior to Zoom because even though his head is made of polygons, it's like 5 feet away from me, and his voice sounds like it's coming from about 5 feet away from me. And so I think on some very deep bodily level, I feel like I've spent time with a friend in physical space in a way that you don't after Zoom. And I
Yeah.
think that that was like some crucial vitamin I was getting.
That's
Um,
so interesting because I was going to ask you. I mean, I feel like your essays come from like embodied experience, I mean, from being in places with people. And that's so fascinating. Have you thought about writing about that? Because
yeah,
that
well,
feels to
you
me
know how many
like,
essays I've written in the last 2 years? Two. I mean, I gave a talk at Sarah Lawrence recently about writing being a much more social undertaking than we generally think of it as. Like in two senses. One is that that's where your material comes from, is interactions with people and conversations with friends, and also just the sense of having an audience out there. I mean, even though everybody else was home watching TV on drugs on their couches like I was, and then there was this huge, hungry audience, I didn't feel them out there. There wasn't the feedback. Um, we all felt very alone. And so, both because of the input and the audience being slowly starved from me, I just didn't write much. You need input. You need people putting thoughts into your head, even if like they're wrong thoughts, even if only to demonstrate to you that what you thought was just obvious common sense and basic human decency is just your opinion.
well, you
uh,
mentioned input. What is your reading life like? I mean, what's your actually let me back up. What's your sort of like media diet? That sounds so stupid, but like what I feel like you're someone I feel like you're very interested in film.
mhm.
But also I'm curious about your reading life. There's a writer named Ted Joya who the other he pointed out a couple of
Right.
years ago. Ted Joya, he's a music writer.
I didn't
And
know.
Ted pointed out that he takes in the ratio. I don't think young writers in particular understand that the ratio of what you take in to what you put out should be extremely high.
Yes.
And so I'm just curious about like what your reading life is like, what your, what kinds of stuff you like to read, and in particular, I'd love to know. I mean, I kind of know because I've read a lot of your interviews, but like, I'd love to hear what some of your big influences are, and what you're reading right now, and what your reading
um,
life is like.
well, like everything else, my reading went steeply downhill in the
Oh
pandemic.
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
Pretty much the only things I read were things my girlfriend and I read out loud together over the phone or over Zoom or in person.
Oh wow.
And we read things like the Odyssey and Mrs. Dalloway and Dante's Inferno and Ovid's Metamorphoses, very high class literary stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Talking about your influences is tricky because I think probably the people who influenced you most aren't necessarily the ones you're conscious of. I mean, I
Yeah.
definitely went through phases where I was enamored of certain writers and imitated them. Like a lot of guys of my generation, I was really into Hunter S. Thompson's journalism when I was in my 20s, and it took
Right.
a while to like shake that voice loose. Um,
Yeah.
and that's what you do is you fall under various writers' influence, and then you shake their voices loose, but a little of it sticks with you and works its way into your prose rhythms or your voice. Um, the living writers whose work I wait for and can't wait to read their next book are Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction writer.
Hmm.
Lionel Shriver's novels and essays I like very much. She's kind of an essayist in drag, like pretending to write fiction. I feel like she's got axes to grind and uses the novel to sharpen them. Um, Ted Chiang, another science fiction writer,
Yeah.
produces very few stories, but each one is a gem. And I'm like many people, I'm waiting for Robert Caro's fifth volume in the LBJ biography. I'm praying for him to make it through the pandemic intact,
Yeah.
finish that,
Yeah.
which must now encompass his entire presidency.
Um, what I we're running out of time here. I wanna I
You know
wanna
what? I mean, probably the people who are biggest influences on me are people like I read when I was 12, like Ray
right.
Bradbury, and they just got so deeply under my skin, I can't feel them there anymore.
I never read Ray Bradbury, and I actually really love it because it's so when you read Ray Bradbury, it's so refreshing because you'll like read a Bradbury story, and it's basically like, I was sitting around one day thinking about how freaking weird it is that I have a skeleton. So I wrote a story about it.
Yeah.
And that's like a Ray Bradbury story. And I love how direct that is.
Yeah. Also, he was maybe the first writer where I noticed he had a prose style.
Yeah.
And I mistakenly worried about, I better, come up with a prose style. I better figure out what my style is going to be, not realizing that the style is the part you can't help.
So my agent is a huge fan of yours, and I know he's watching. And
Austin Kleon's agent.
his name's Ted, and he has a question he's been asking everybody. I don't ask people this question because I don't actually have a lot of hope, or but he's been asking everyone, what gives you hope, or what like keeps you going right now. What's the thing that kind of pulls you through your days? Yeah.
My relationships with people are what
keep
me going. I don't care about much else at this point. I'm trying to remember how you care about writing so I can teach next week. I think it's my friendships and relationships with other people that I'm hanging in for. On the macro scale, one thing I like about Kim Stanley Robinson is that I don't think he thinks of hope as a feeling. He sees it as an attitude and a philosophical stance.
Yeah.
He calls himself, I think, intellectually a pessimist and emotionally an optimist.
I think Rebecca Solnit's like that. She's like, hope is just.
Yeah, I love Rebecca Solnit. And in fact, he and Kim Stanley Robinson are like the little angels hovering over my right shoulder when I write, always shaming me if I sound too pessimistic or cynical. Because I was like that. Now, would Rebecca Solnit say this?
I love that.
Move this one little bit. Are you really helping here?
Yeah. Are you really helping here? I love that.
I feel like that's what you ought to be doing as a writer or any kind of artist, is helping.
And
it doesn't mean being cheerful or Pollyanna-ish. Francis Bacon, the painter, was helping. William S. Burroughs helps, but we all help in different ways. I have to get through this thing.
I have 1,000 other things I want to ask you, but I want to respect your time, as they say.
Oh yeah, I got things to do.
And I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for your work, and I want to thank you for doing this. This is a real thrill to me. I'm going to ask you one more question.
Sure.
Do you play the piano?
Yeah. I never learned to read or write music, but I just started playing by ear as a kid. But only in quarantine did I actually learn to play anything. Like, there's now YouTube videos, tutorials that show you how to play without you knowing how to read a note of music.
My son Owen is ear taught, and I can't get him to read music. He just doesn't care. He's like, why would I do that?
Would have liked very much for me to take piano lessons, and I regret that I did not, because I know better now if I had.
I'm trying to tell him that, but anyway, what did you learn to play during quarantine?
I learned to play several Eric Satie pieces, which sound simple, but in fact are not, because he doesn't use time signatures. So the hard part isn't memorizing the notes, but figuring out how to make it sing. Like, what's the inflection here?
Yes.
And I also learned a Chopin piece, which was much harder than the Satie.
Oh, yeah.
And I learned to play the complete theme from Superman.
What could be better? That's a good mix. I love that.
I'm sure the neighbors are a little tired of
it. Well, they can deal. Thank you for this. I'm pushing you. I pushed you off screen to start a mailing list because I want people to be able to follow you online. But I think everyone, the best thing that they can do, if you haven't yet, get a copy of We Learn Nothing. Get a copy of I Wrote This Book Because I Love You.
Well, and you're trying to plug them.
And go online, and if you've got a New York Times subscription, his the New York Times archive of your stuff is incredible. You're on Medium.
I also wrote for Medium.com for over a year, and I've got a lot of nice essays there that not that many people have ever seen.
There's some really good stuff on Medium. I am old school. I dumped your Medium feed into my RSS reader.
So thank
that
you.
I still check.
I'm so old
So
school, I don't really know what that
you
is.
don't know what that is. That's fine. That's I admire the way that you've sort of like stayed out of the shit stream, as you say,
Yeah.
because
I I don't like what social media does to people. I think Twitter's turned everybody into mean middle school kids. Like
I
they
would
love ganging up and destroying the uncool kids for fun and pretending it's out of self-righteous outrage. It's real
I
behavior.
uh,
Almost anything anyone's gotten canceled for is more attractive to me than people ganging up to destroy them with glee. Not quite, but almost.
well, I don't. I think everyone should quit Twitter immediately, myself included. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. But
Well, they're
Tim,
just ridiculous.
thank you so much. I hope I hope our paths cross in person again someday. But
No,
thank you
anybody
again.
cross in person again.
Anybody, really, it would be great. So thanks a lot, and I hope you learn how to write again, as we all,
Thanks for your kind words about my
as we
work,
all hope.
sincerely. And Dana, I know you're watching. That's my webmistress. Austin Kleon would like me to start a mailing list. Maybe you could help me out with that.
Dana, we got to get on this. We're gonna make this happen. So thanks, Tim, and thanks to everybody watching. I appreciate your time, and keep going.